Okay, so we talked yesterday, or whatever day it was, Friday, about like this rise of nativism and this sort of like anti-radical sentiment. Can you name for me an event that happened in 1920 that made us really nervous about radicals in general? The Wall Street bombing, which leads to things like the Red Scare for sure, but I was talking specifically about that Wall Street bombing. So again, we're just kind of nervous about other groups. We also looked at like immigration rates, and we can see how even though we had concerns about the new immigrants back in the Gilded Age, like if we were worried about this then, we're definitely going to be worried about the new immigrants in this sort of like World War I and later era. So anyway, the Attorney General at the time is this guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, and he is unconcerned with civil liberties, right? So he is so preoccupied with the idea of protecting Americans from radicalism that he's not super worried about like First Amendment rights or due process or protecting like the integrity of the judicial system. And so like the famous, or I guess infamous, Palmer raids are going to be mostly unconstitutional. And anyone who was reported as having like radical sympathies could easily find themselves deported if they weren't U.S. citizens, even if they hadn't done anything actually wrong. Even U.S. citizens would find themselves under a whole bunch of legal scrutiny that they probably didn't deserve. So just this general, and like the effect of that, like if you hear about your friend who like, ooh, somebody reported on them of having like a copy of the Communist Manifesto on their bookshelf, well then that makes me want to get rid of my copy of the Communist Manifesto and never talk about it or do anything. You know, does that make sense? Like, the repressive effect is pretty significant. This sense that to be associated or even to be thinking about communism or socialism or anarchism is going to be a really big problem. So here's a picture of people being deported. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial is another interesting like element. You've read about it in your textbook. We don't really have time to talk about the whole story. But basically, these two guys, they were Italian immigrants. That's strike one. They had once been to an anarchist meeting. That's strike two. And they are sort of vaguely implicated in the murder of some shoe maker guy, cobbler. Yeah. Anyway, and so with almost no actual evidence and only a little bit of circumstantial evidence, they're both convicted, summarily sentenced to death, and executed, all very quickly. And so this both shows like how crazy people were about just assuming the worst of someone for like having ideas that were different or from being an immigrant, but also is kind of a high watermark because the country sort of takes a collective breath after the Sacco and Vanzetti executions and sort of goes, did we just kill people? Just because they were kind of suspicious, maybe? Like, maybe that's a little bit much. And so, for example, we see major newspapers running editorials, like condemning the execution and arguing that, like, justice wasn't served and we should have been more careful about the process or whatever. And that's a big deal because before the trial, people would have been too afraid to, like, be defending, anarchists or whatever. That wouldn't have been a thing. So it's interesting, kind of like, we saw the high water mark with the KKK, right, 1925, this huge number of marchers, this huge number of registered members, and then also, like, scandals come, and then we sort of come back down from there. We get to this peak, and then people sort of come to their senses, sort of. Here's a good one. Not wanted, Uncle Sam, the door to immigrants is closed, but you see red, rum, and Rome, right? Let's not have any Catholics. Who was that Catholic guy that ran for election? Al Smith, good, so no Catholics. We don't want drinkers. Remember, this is the era of prohibition, so officially there's no drinking here in the United States. And then no communists, as it were. So let's talk a little bit about those immigration laws. As we mentioned in the warm-up, they were both the Emergency Quota Act and the National Origins Act. You've read about these in your book, and I'm kind of relying upon that information. But just to sort of give you a big summary, both of these laws are going to have two effects. The first one is to drastically reduce immigration as a whole. So they significantly cut the total number of immigrants that come into this country. So effect number one is to significantly reduce the total number of immigrants coming to this country. And then the second thing that they both do is to preferentially treat the so-called old immigrants, the Northern and Western European immigrants, at the expense of the new immigrants or immigrants from East Asia or Latin America. So both of them cut the number of total immigrants and then significantly prefer immigrants from North and West Europe, or Northern and Western Europe. No, not so much extreme vetting. It was about quotas, like as the Emergency Quota Act suggests. This is more detail than you really have to know, but so what they did was they set quotas based on the number of people from that country in the United States in 1900. So like, because the new immigration was relatively new, right? People hadn't been coming from those places for that long. Like, the total number of people from England in this country was much bigger than the total number of people from Italy, for example, right? So even though we cut it to 2% of both, like of the number of both in 1900, that would obviously be a much larger portion of like English people, right? Does that make sense? So it's just like the way they use this flat quota based on the number of people who were here at this time in the past is just preferentially like focusing on groups that have been here longer, and like newer arriving groups are going to have a much smaller total number. So like here's a group of like some data that obviously don't add up because these are just like three big regions and then one particular country, and so like there's other places that are coming in, right? So it doesn't all add up. Don't try to make the math work, I swear. But so for example, you can see that like 1921 we'd had many more people coming in from Southern Europe, but after that 1924 National Origins Act, we see that number cut significantly, and we also see cuts from Northern Europe, right? But not quite as drastic, right, in terms of the proportion that we would be talking about. Note similar cuts in size from like an immigration from Asia, but notice that immigration from Mexico is not particularly affected, right? Latin America isn't really included in these laws. It's not a form of immigration that we're really worried about. So actually, the Immigration Act has sort of a double effect of also increasing the proportion of Latin American immigrants in the country because they're not really excluded from this law. And so here's where we kind of begin to see a growing number of Latin American immigrants, like proportional to the rest of our immigrant populations. Whereas prior to this, immigrants to the United States from East Asia and from Europe as a whole were much more significant than immigrants coming in from Latin America. So anyway, there's that. The last thing that we have to talk about is just the idea of fundamentalism. And although fundamentalism can mean a lot of things in this context, it's fundamentalism in Christianity. And it's basically the idea or the set of ideas that like the Bible is literally true. Everything it says is literally true word for word. And that following like biblical law should be like our primary concern for government. Like we should make that our focus. And so this kind of like can be seen, like the rise of fundamentalism is really sort of a reaction to modernism, right? Just like the First Great Awakening was a reaction to the American Enlightenment, right? The Second Great Awakening, a reaction to the Market Revolution. Like this is another reaction, this big religious sort of upswelling, sort of conservative values, like in response to this modernist movement and urbanization and you know, new music and new style and whatever. But it all kind of comes to a head over the question of teaching of evolution in schools, right? In the 1920s is when we really begin to see, for example, like Charles Darwin's theories have finally been kind of like applied to people and then also developed in such a way that like some people want to teach them as like the foundations in biology as opposed to like as this sort of like wacky theory, which has been kind of referred to as before. Anyway, lots of states, especially in the South and West, they put laws on the books that say that you cannot teach evolution in schools, cannot, illegal to do so. And so the ACLU believes that this is a violation of our rights to free speech and to free expression. And so the ACLU looks for a test case, and they find this guy, Daniel, I think, well, whatever his name is, Scopes, and he's a biology teacher in Tennessee, and they say, hey, I want you to teach evolution, and then admit to it, and then you're going to get charged, and we're going to defend you, and we want to challenge these laws. We want to show that these laws are unconstitutional. So he does exactly that. He teaches evolution, he admits to it, he gets in trouble. But the trial itself, which is sometimes called the Scopes monkey trial, because people like associated the idea of Darwinism or evolution with like people evolved from monkeys, and so that, anyway. The Scopes monkey trial becomes a national event, right? People are listening to the trial on the radio, and there's commentators, everybody is talking on this particular event. Now, the actual like facts of the case are pretty cut and dry. Is he found guilty? Yes, because he out loud says, I taught evolution, and the law says you can't teach evolution, and therefore he is, you know, guilty. But on the broader basis, this trial really became a trial of fundamentalism itself. Like, is fundamentalism like a path forward for our country? Is it reasonable? And the two central players don't actually have anything to do with John T. Scopes. It's Clarence Darrow, who is the lawyer for the ACLU. I don't know of any like modern day defense lawyers that we would like know about, but Darrow was very famous. He had been a lawyer on lots of really high profile cases. He was the real deal, like probably the best defense attorney in the entire country at the time. And then the prosecutor, the attorney for the prosecution, is going to be William Jennings Bryan. Yes, that William Jennings Bryan, the one who ran for president and the populist guy and the cross of gold. Remember all that? So Jennings Bryan is a very strong fundamentalist himself. He's extraordinarily conservative, and so the trial really becomes like a trial of fundamentalism. And for example, Darrow will put Jennings Bryan on the stand himself. So like Darrow will actually have William Jennings Bryan take the stand, and he asks him all kinds of questions, like, so in Genesis, what does it say? How was the earth created? Well, the earth was created in 7 days. 7 24-hour days? Yes, 7 24-hour days. And then, Darrow shows all this evidence about like geological formations and like evidence that proves that it had to have taken millions of years and da-da-da-da. So you still think 7 24-hour days? Yes, 7 24-hour days. Well, how can that all be true? Well, it's just false. It can't be true. Like just sort of denialism or whatever. Okay, well, how about the story of Jonah? Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Well, actually, it was a big fish. Okay, he was swallowed by a big fish, and what happened to him? He was spit out and he was alive. Is that actually possible? Can a person actually be da-da-da? Well, it says so in the Bible. It's absolutely true. And he just sort of looks kind of silly. He also gets really flustered, like his beliefs being so publicly questioned, and like being confronted with all of this evidence and like not having any way to kind of get around it. It's sort of sad, but William Jennings Bryan actually dies like a week or two after the trial of a heart attack. Like the stress of the whole process was really challenging for him. But in the end, even though Scopes is going to be found guilty, like public perception after this is very negative of fundamentalism. Like the idea of fundamentalism as a direction of our country is not something that the country will regard well. And so there is this sort of shift, like fundamentalists are then seen as like backwards, and like you're only going to be fundamentalist or you find fundamentalists if you're in some like tiny little podunk southern town or whatever, and these people are not the way of the future, and like this is not something that we should aspire to be, that kind of thing. So then the idea of like disillusionment or frustration is pretty high, and the 20s, are kind of a complicated time, and there's all sorts of changes and hedonism and focus on the economy, and who cares about progressivism and like doing the right thing or whatever. And so a fair number of like literary greats of the time, most notably F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway are going to call themselves the so-called lost generation, and many of them like moved to France, and they sort of set up this new like American focus of literature in France, and basically they just talk about like how hypocritical and superficial America is, and they write a whole bunch of super depressing work like The Great Gatsby, and that's the end. So the lost generation. Okay, good.